Right, welcome back. So here's the second wave of feminism video. So second wave, remember we left first wave, women got the vote in 1920. The wave was just over. Everybody like went and took a nap. I don't know what happened. It just stopped. But also keep in mind that while that all was happening, that the latter part into from 1900 up to 1920 was also World War One. So World War One was 1914 to 1919, but the United States didn't get involved until 1917. So we entered the war late. We entered all the wars late. We entered the war late, and I think the whole country was just kind of tired. So it wasn't just that, these like Susan B. Anthony's of the world, these like sort of nationalistic, white privileged, old white ladies just crapped out once they got the vote. It was also that the country was kind of tired, right? World War One really knocked our socks off in the sense, not that kind of has a positive connotation, in the sense that it was the first World War. It was just a lot. So first wave was just, over, right? It was just over. It also, again, was exposed to be really racist. Not really, I mean, yeah, it's of course racist, but it also created this narrative, or let me say a different way. It exposed the narrative of race and nationality. So in first wave, there's this, I don't even want to write that in my second wave board, race and nationality. So there were a lot of white women like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, you might know her from the Yellow Wallpaper, and a number of other people, even Margaret Sanger, who came, up with and argued for birth control, wanted really birth control for women of color so that they could have more white babies, and there could be family planning for whites to have more children so that they didn't get overrun in the country with children of color. And so there's this really like proven clear connection between racism and nationality, and this idea that America should be for Anglos, it should be for whites, it should be for Christians. And that gets incredibly problematic as we go more through feminism and get from, the birth control movement that had nationalistic and racist undertones into second wave feminism, where there were forced sterilizations of women of color. Okay. So there's a lot of threads that connect. Some of them are really ugly, like the racism, but there's also just connections, which is why we always teach them in chronological order. Okay, so just keep these in mind. Always make connections. I'm not always going to be able to make them here on the videos. I'm trying to keep them short. So try and see where things are connecting in your mind, between what I'm showing you with the different waves. All right, second wave feminism, I divide into two parts. I think it's really important to show that it's not one thing. It's two very distinct movements to me. So the first part of second wave feminism has a lot to do with World War II. And why do you think that is? Does anybody remember why World War II becomes a really big part of feminism? Maybe we wouldn't put a war together with feminism. One woman symbolizes the whole thing. You've probably got it. Rosie the Riveter, right? Rosie the Riveter. And a riveter is the thing that you put like lug nuts on a car, if you have a flat tire, it's the that thing. So a riveter, I think. So Rosie the Riveter is important because she's in coveralls. Beyonce did a cover of her too, with the red kerchief, and she's like, bam, right? So Rosie the Riveter becomes really, really important, and really the symbol of all of the first part of second wave feminism, because she symbolizes the fact that as all of the men, I mean, really 3/4 of the men go off to war in Europe, the women picked up their jobs. And so we're going from this first wave feminism where women are so incompetent, apparently, because they have uteruses and wombs and, you know, I have boobs, I can't vote, right? So incompetent. Then 30 years later, less, 20 years later, in one generation, 20 years later, these women are running the world. Who runs the world? Girls, right? Like, they're really running the world. They're building tanks. They're the CEOs. All the men are gone. These women are running the show. But that's not just the important part. It's not the important part just that women are showing other people that they can be the boss, right? It's not just that. It's also the internalization of that. It's that these women, yes, they're being like hashtag boss, yes. But it's also the internal. It's that they get bank accounts for the first time. They get to come home from work and have a smoke, right? Everybody smoked filterless Lucky Strikes. Have a smoke, sit there in their overalls, drink a beer, and hang out the way the guys did. What does that feel like, right? You were just kept having like 9 kids, and then all of a sudden, because all the men are gone, what also is not happening? Sex. There's no kids. What? Listen, I got kids. They're nice and all, but holy crap, it's a lot, right? So all of a sudden, here's Rosie. She's like, yeah, I got a husband. He's all right. He's gone. I have a job. I get to wake up every morning and have a purpose. A purpose. I get to go to work. I get to feel good about myself, that I'm thriving at this job. I'm maybe a manager. I'm a boss. I'm doing the payroll. I'm not the secretary. I'm not fetching coffee for you. Go get coffee for me, right? I'm Rosie. I'm Rosie the Riveter. I get a bank account. I get to keep, because my man's gone, I get to keep my whole paycheck, right? I'm paying the mortgage. I'm paying the bills. I get to hang out with my girls all night. And maybe some people miss sex, but guess what? Remember, birth control is like meh, and men are not into it. So I don't have to have children if I don't want to. I get to go be a boss. I get to spend my money. What happens when you have money and no kids? You get free time, right? You get free time. So what's really cool about the first part of second wave feminism is that women get to have an identity. Like, really, for the first time, these women get to be whoever they want to be. Because the patriarchy, while it's still institutionalized patriarchy, there's still some, asshole at the boss sexually harassing and like ass pinching people. Don't forget that. But so many hundreds of thousands of men are gone, to the point that women get to, it's not a matriarchy, it doesn't go that far, but women get to have space and time. And that had never, ever happened before. Okay. Really intense time. So I'm running out of time. I'm trying to make the videos short. So think that through, though, what that must have felt like to have a job, to have your house to yourself, to be able to dictate what you get to do in your own time, right? You're not just a wife. You're not just a mother. You're not being told you're so incompetent you can't vote. You get to be a whole person. Yeah? You get to be a whole person. So Rosie the Riveter is really the first part of second wave feminism. And what's interesting here is that for sure there was still a racial divide, right? This is still Jim Crow era, segregation era. I'm not pretending there's not just layers and layers of racism here. But this also was, Black women also got to go into the workforce, right? Black men were fighting in World War II, tons of them, right? They were being treated horribly. They were, it was awful. I'm not going to get into the history. Sorry. I also teach so much history that I want to keep talking about the history. But, you know, Black women got a lot. I mean, white women got a lot. Black women also got some. It was something, right? Latinas got something. It was, I don't think Asian women got a lot. I think they were still pretty maligned, but it still was really something, right? Women were really getting somewhere. And then, so be on that high with me, right? Be on the high with me of second wave feminism. We are Rosie the Riveters. We are Black, white, Latina, Rosie the Riveters. Yeah. We're like, I got money, I got time, I'm hanging out with my girlfriends. Part 2. What happens? Because you know that's not going to last. What happens? The war ends. The war ends. So, oh, sorry. World War II ends. We're in the like late 40s. The war ends. Hitler offs himself in a bunker. The Russians free Auschwitz. The US comes in. Europe is decimated. Europe is just ruined. Remember that Hitler bombed Paris, bombed London. Like Europe was just, and of course, destroyed the entire country of Poland. Really just leveled. Europe is a mess. So the United States, rather than, you know, helping, runs with it and says, Europe's a mess, but they've been in charge of everything for thousands of years, right? Let me not go that far. Hundreds of years, Europe has been the boss of the entire world. So we're going to now take a leap into that first place. So this really is the moment where the US becomes a world superpower. Europe is screwed. They have to rebuild all their buildings from the ground up. So the US, all the men come home and we just hit the ground running as a country. We hit the ground running. So that, get a little closer because my handwriting's so bad. So all the men come home, they all go back to work. And what else do they do? What's the first thing the men do when they get home? They knock up their wives. Here's the thing. It's not just about sex, right? I mean, I'm sure that they missed sex. I'm sure that they wanted to have it. The wives probably did too. I get it. But here's the thing. What happens when a guy who's raised in this very traditional patriarchy comes home from the war and sees that his wife, who was supposed to be an angel in the house, all of a sudden now is Rosie the Riveter? So the angel in the house is in overalls. She wasn't supposed to wear pants. She's in overalls with a kerchief. She's got like an anchor tattooed on her arm. Right? The husband's like, what the fuck? I mean, right? So what's he going to do to put his woman back in her place? He's going to knock her up. So I argue that it's not, the baby boom wasn't about sex. It wasn't like, oh, all these men came home from war and loved their wives. No, that's too easy. That's too simple. The men came home from the war, World War II. They saw that their wives were paying the mortgage, paying the bills, had bank accounts, had social lives, and were doing their jobs. They were building the tanks, building the airplanes, running the stores, running the shops. They were running the world. I keep conjuring Beyonce, but they were running, the girls literally were running the world. So how are you going to knock that like hashtag boss off her pedestal. You knock her up, right? You get her pregnant. So how do they get their jobs back? How do they take their power back? Right? They get all the women preggers. They get them pregnant. Then we have, because everybody's pregnant, we have what's called the baby boom. And there's literally millions of babies being born. This is my parents' generation, all the people born in the 50s. Like the war ends, 48, all the babies are born in like, whatever, 49, 50, 51. My parents, I think, were born like 55, 52, 56, something like that. Maybe your grandparents' generation is all the baby booms. So now this is where we get barefoot and pregnant as a phrase. Barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, right? Barefoot and pregnant. So what ends up happening in the 1950s, right, is that what was called hysteria in women in the first wave, when they were told they couldn't write, they couldn't go to school, they couldn't vote, they couldn't think, these women became hysterical. What happens in the 1950s, so we move from the 1900s hysteria, put it in quotes, right? Because it's a pseudoscience, is that we get in the 1950s, everyone becomes neurotic. And the housewives, because now they're housewives, all get addicted to pills. They just get super addicted to like lithium, Xanax. It's like our version of oxycodone, Oxycontin. These women, in order to cope, in order to deal at all with the fact that they have been subsumed back into second and third and fourth class citizenship, numb themselves. But as Brene Brown famously says in her Power of Vulnerability TED Talk, you cannot selectively numb. If you think that, drinking 5 vodkas and a bottle of wine or taking Xanax or smoking weed all day, you think you're numbing the stress? Yes, you're also numbing the joy, the creativity, the motivation to do anything, right? You're going to sit around and be drunk and high all the time, right? You cannot selectively numb. And that's what the women of the 1950s did. They called it was Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir. And they called it the housewife fatigue. And the housewife fatigue, that was from Friedan, says that I can't cope. I can't cope with suddenly becoming nothing again. Trigger warnings, women were committing suicide more often, eating disorders started to become rampant, and drug addiction, really vast drug addiction from women, right? Popping these pills. They were called like mother's little helpers, these Xanax, right? Lithium, just really intense, what we would consider kind of intense medication nowadays. It's why they got banned kind of, because it was really drugging these women out. So what happens after this? Maybe I should say there's 3 parts really, because this is all still second wave feminism. Come with me back over here. Sorry, this is so analog. Okay, so what ends up happening is that Simone de Beauvoir from France, she says that women are otherized. capital O, other, capital O, other. And then women are otherized in a way that not only makes them second-class citizens, it makes them feel marginalized. So that then we get all this drinking and drugs and women having, vodka bottles hidden in the back of the sink, the toilet, the part, whatever that's part called in the back. So this is Simone de Beauvoir. Betty Friedan is the Housewife Fatigue. She interviewed all these women that she knew, and everybody kept saying, sorry for the hiccups. Everybody kept saying they were so tired, they were so exhausted. They had brain fog. It's kind of like now. And she called it housewife fatigue, that their lives felt so meaningless, that their identities were really taken, really just stripped away from them. Okay. So that's the 1950s, this otherization and this self-internalized oppression, or this oppression that becomes internalized oppression. So internalized oppression can mean a lot of things. Like if, Victoria's Secret models are seen as the only way to exist as a woman, then we internalize the oppression and start hating bikini season, bathing suit season. We, now in your generation, kids' generation, we have body positivity, we have Lizzo, we have all this stuff, but internalized oppression is still very real for a number of different things, right? Like we take on any stereotype, the angry Black woman, so that anytime a Black woman is angry, we're like, angry Black woman, rather than seeing the legitimacy of her anger and asking, how can I help you in this moment? Like, what can I do for you? You seem frustrated, like what's happening, right? We're like, okay. So women started really internalizing this otherization. They started really taking it in. And because it was so awful, there were there were a lot of suicides. There was this drug addiction. There was also, though, this rebellion. It wasn't all just women dying and literally and dying emotionally, spiritually. There were some revolts, and it ended up coming in a small wave and then a big wave. So the third part to second wave feminism is the 1960s. And what's the 1960s? The hippies, right? The hippies, free love, bra burning. So we get from the 1950s where it's, think of the movie The Help, which is such a shitty movie, but think about Viola Davis, think about these female characters, these Black female characters who are super oppressed, similarly to the way white women were oppressed, but it was racialized and patriarchy, right? So then when we get to later, another decade passes by, and we have not just, for white women and whites in general, we also have civil rights. We have the Black Panthers. So this next part of the third part of second wave feminism also is a kind of intersectionality because it's civil rights. And the civil rights movement is taking off. There's the Chicano movement, there's AIM, American Indian movement, there's Asian American movements, there's Black movements, as we well know, with Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, right? The big famous ones. And of course, the Panthers. So here's where things divide a little bit. So here's the racism of second wave feminism, is that it often was white women getting PhDs. Sorry, that describes me. So it becomes a lot of white women being like, you know what, screw this. I'm not going to give in to the Xanax. I'm not giving into the lithium. I'm not going to become an alcoholic. I'm where I was, and now I'm better. I'm going to go get a PhD. I'm going to go into academia. I'm going to go be a teacher, a professor, a doctor. Women can go to college now. It's a whole thing. But you have to have money to do that. So not only was it a racial divide, it was a class divide. So here we have these middle and upper class white women, you know, trying to get out of their housewife fatigue and their baby boomness. Their kids are kind of grown, right? By the 60s, their kids are teenagers and they're like, I'm going to start over, right? So they go get degrees, they go to college, they go do all this cool stuff. Great. But Black women were never enfranchised economically. There was all these racist policies, redlining, segregation. Jim Crow was way up into the 50s and 60s. Colored water fountains, white water fountains, segregated schools. So we're not coming out of the gate equally. Yeah, there's no equity here. Because African Americans were oppressed for so long, these white women who had money and education, like high school, all this stuff, jump and go get college degrees. Well, Black women aren't there. They weren't allowed in any way into society to be educated. Can you remember Ruby Bridges, the little African American girl walking up in her little pinafore with the pigtails and the two little braids, and all of these white women, like grown ass white women, screaming and spitting in her face because she was going to be the first Black girl in that school, right? So to say like, oh, it's the 1960s, you know, racism's over, was not even remotely the case. Racism was worse than ever. It was worse than ever. Okay. So here's the intersectionality. The Black Panther, so for Black women, now we went from Sojourner Truth 1850s to Black women 1950s. Here I am, I'm a Black woman. I either want to get ahead and go get a PhD, but then I have to deal with white women, right? I have to deal with these like microaggressive white women. So I don't really want to be in the feminist movement over here. But my intersectionality says, okay, I have not just gender, I have race. So these white women are kind of, you know, sneaky racist, if not outright racist. I'm going to go jump over and be with my folks of color. But then, so I'm like, okay, not forget the PhD. As a Black woman, I'm going to go join the Black Panthers. But then what happens to me when I'm in with the Panthers? The men are telling me to go get their coffee, right? So as a Black woman, my intersectionality is still really complex, and I'm not being allowed in either of the worlds still. So I just lived through Jim Crow segregation. I just lived through the oppression of white women. Still exists. And now I'm still trapped. I don't get to burn my bra. I don't get to go be a Panther because they're telling me to go get their coffee. There's still women, always there's some women who break through this, right? Angela Davis, there's tons of Black women who are breaking through. There's tons of white women who are breaking through, Gloria Steinem. And they're intersectional, they're doing really great. They're doing the anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-everything work. It's great, but it's not enough. It's one or two people that are breaking through this traditional racist, sexist, you know, mold, right? It's not enough. And then one of the big questions was, which do you support? Do you support feminism and like passing Roe v. Wade, which didn't happen until 1973? Do you fight for women's rights, or do you fight for civil rights? Do you go march with King on Selma? Or do you fight for Roe v. Wade? I mean, those are, 15 years apart, but right, just as examples. Do you see what I'm saying? So it gets, I don't know why. I mean, there's a million reasons why. Brainstorm out, write in the comments. Why can't these come together? Right? Like, why can't we ever come together? And we really never do. Arguably, we don't now. Right? We still haven't sort of figured this out. So here's the third part. And then how does second wave feminism end? How does this end? Vietnam. Right? You can picture Muhammad Ali burning his draft card, right? Vietnam, just sort of takes over. And people, the hippies are really anti-war, anti-colonization, get out of other countries. We have our own problems in the United States, like mind your business, get out of Vietnam. But then all these people are serving in Vietnam. There's the draft. That tends to be a class issue and a race issue. There were more people of color. There were more lower income people because they wanted the GI Bill. If I go to war, then the government's going to pay for my college. That's called the GI Bill. I get veterans benefits, but then more low income and people of color are dying for the country, right? Where whites are in college. So then it creates this educational disparity, a racial disparity, a wealth disparity, right? It's a domino effect. Things don't happen in a vacuum in history. They have impact consequences later on. So Vietnam really takes over. That's a hot mess. The hippies start spitting on the veterans. It's disgusting, right? That's like wasn't the guy's fault that they were in the war, right? So that just becomes a whole mess. And then we get to the 70s and 80s. We get the crack cocaine epidemic. We get Reaganomics. We get this war on drugs, war on poverty. And what does all that become? A war on Black folks, right? That all becomes an excuse to and then Stonewall happens, right, against the queer community. So it all AIDS becomes an epidemic. So it all becomes an excuse to take whatever momentum we had built up as any kind of minority, as a woman, as a person of color, as a queer identified person, any minority in the United States, as a low income person, that momentum that had been building and churning in the 1960s into the 70s got completely smashed, got completely decimated because there was a war. They might have called it, the government might have called it, a war on poverty, a war on crime, a war on drugs. Nancy Reagan with her Just Say No campaign. Whatever the hell they told you was happening was really just let poor women and people of color die. Queers, let them die. That really was the government thing. They knew about AIDS forever. This isn't even conspiracy theory. I'm saying this as a historian, a PhD in American studies. I am telling you, the government knew all about this stuff and let people die, right? So it's like every single wave had momentum and then just got really violently shut down. Okay, so sorry to leave you on this note. Second wave feminism did not end well, but civil rights did happen, right? King got assassinated, X got assassinated, JFK, RFK, they all got, I mean, you know, Medgar Evers, Emmett Till, like it was awful. It was awful time. Not but, semicolon, however, we did as a country get, after JFK was assassinated, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson did pass all of the civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act up to 65. And really, that was the most important one, that enfranchised African Americans to actually vote. So even though the Civil War ended in 1865, African Americans were not enfranchised at all until 1965. It was 100 years of Jim Crow terrorism. Okay. All right. Okay. So how then do we get to third wave feminism? What even is third wave feminism? Stay tuned. That felt really YouTube-y. Sorry. That's my next video, third wave and fourth wave. I'm going to combine them.